You wake to the sound of drums. The air is a blade of frost against your skin, the iron smell of blood mingling with wood smoke and seawater. Around you, the Viking settlement is alive with noise, the crack of axes, the chanting of men whose faces are smeared with ochre and ash. Steam rises from the snow where blood has fallen, curling into the pale morning light like the breath of the gods themselves. You are dragged by your hair toward a ring of stones, your wrists bound with wet leather. The crowd watches, unblinking, as the priest raises a horn carved from bone. The screaming you hear is not defiance, it is prayer. And then it dawns on you. This isn't execution, it's initiation. A rite of power, older than kingdoms, sanctified by fear. The gods of this land demand not worship, but spectacle. Behind the smoke and the saga songs, the Viking world gleams with both brilliance and rot. Ships that touched every horizon, empires that traded silk and slaves, temples that married blood with belief. The glory we romanticize was built on rituals of domination so intimate, so systematic, that even death seemed merciful beside them. What follows are those rituals. 7 levels of depravity buried beneath legend, preserved in sagas, laws, and the bones unearthed from frozen soil. If this descent into forgotten rituals grips you, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. It helps resurrect what history tried to bury. The Viking world stretched from the volcanic shores of Iceland to the glittering courts of Byzantium, a civilization both brutal and refined. They traded amber and silver, carried slaves and stories, and stitched the North into the fabric of the known world. Yet beneath that grandeur lay something older, a web of rites that bound violence, faith, and desire into one machinery of control. These were not drunken myths or isolated acts of savagery. They were institutionalized rituals of psychological warfare, recorded in chronicles like Heimskringla and Uslendingabok, and confirmed by the bones and altars unearthed at Uppsala, Ribe, and Gamla Uppsala. 7 levels, each darker, more deliberate, reveal how the Norse turned intimacy into conquest, and how their gods fed not on faith but on the surrender of the human soul. The Norsemen called their sacred rites blot, offerings of blood meant to bind gods and mortals in a single pulse of hunger. But what most don't realize is how these rituals evolved beyond the divine, into an organized system of power and humiliation. To understand Viking dominance, one must ascend through 7 levels of perversion, each a rung deeper into the machinery of sanctified control. Every conquest began not with a sword, but with a mark. New captives, women, children, foreigners, were stripped and branded with heated iron before being allowed to breathe the same air as their conquerors. The Norse saw this as more than ownership. It was a theological transaction. In the sagas, Odin was said to claim the worthy with pain. The branding iron carried runes of power, usually the alges or tiwas, symbols of sacrifice and victory. Witnesses described the act as strangely ceremonial, drums echoing in the longhouse, priests chanting verses while the iron glowed white in the fire. The smell of burnt flesh mixed with pine resin, the screams were part of the offering. Those branded were no longer people, they became far, those fit to be given. Archaeological digs in Ribe uncovered bone fragments with rune scars matching those etched on altar stones, the same curvature, the same precision, suggesting these marks were both literal and ritual. The chroniclers who saw it wrote without emotion. The flesh is sealed, and the soul bound, one Frankish missionary noted in the 9th century, as though the gods signed their name upon the skin. In Viking law codes like Gragas, slaves marked in this way could never testify or inherit, even if freed later. The mark was a permanent exile from humanity. When the iron cooled, another ritual began, the captives' feast. The Vikings called it Vigblot, a blood feast for the war dead, but beneath the songs and toasts, it served as a grotesque theater of domination. During victory celebrations, captives, often women from conquered villages, were forced to serve wine and food to their captors, humiliated before the entire assembly. In some accounts, they were compelled to dance upon command, while warriors reenacted the raid with obscene mimicry. To the Norse, this degradation wasn't random cruelty, it was devotion. The gods, they believed, took pleasure in symmetry. The conqueror above, the conquered below, each playing their ordained part. Contemporary chroniclers from the Carolingian frontier reported that the women of Saxony were given as vessels for the feast, their shame considered an offering. At Hedeby, one of the great Viking trading ports, excavations uncovered clay tablets with lists written in Old Norse runes, inventory scrolls that classified captives as silver value, half, excellent condition, damaged. These records appeared alongside notes of livestock and mead, human lives reduced to entries in a mercantile system. Economists analyzing those ledgers concluded that the average slave in the 9th century fetched about 40–50 silver coins, the same as a fine cloak or a hunting dog. The systematic nature of it is chilling. These rituals of humiliation weren't drunken excess, they were economy. They turned human degradation into profit, sanctified through the language of faith. Few rites blur the boundary between religion and cruelty, like the trial of the bride. Among the Norse elite, marriage was both a transaction and a spectacle of dominance. Chronicles and sagas, Engja's saga, Laxdala saga, describe ceremonies where a bride's purity was publicly tested to ensure her worth. But in border raids, this ritual took on a nightmarish inversion. Captive women were paraded as offerings of fertility, forced to undergo mock marriages before entire assemblies of warriors. The laws of Gulathing mention fines for improper testing, implying that these acts were so common they needed regulation. Some scholars argue that the trial involved symbolic penetration with ceremonial objects, such as the hilt of a sword or a carved idol of Freyr, the fertility god depicted with grotesque exaggeration. The euphemistic term used in runic inscriptions, to weigh her honor, conceals what was, in essence, a public degradation ritual. But behind the savagery lay calculation. By turning intimacy into theater, Viking chieftains established dominance not just over the body, but over the soul. Every man in attendance learned the same lesson. Conquest was not just territorial, it was psychological. And the women who survived were never seen as victims, but as tamed spoils, stripped of identity and redefined through shame. One law scroll from the early 11th century even granted tax deductions to warriors who brought fruitful brides from abroad, as if the entire process were a form of tribute to the gods and state alike. It is here the Viking world begins to resemble something colder, a civilization that industrialized humiliation. At the turning of the seasons, when the sun returned after the long Nordic winter, the people gathered at the temples of Uppsala to ensure fertility. Chroniclers like Adam of Bremen described altars drenched in blood, where 9 of every living kind, including humans, were sacrificed to Odin, Freyr, and Thor. But beneath the pageantry lay a ritual so perverse it verged on agricultural slavery. Captured women and concubines were offered as seed-bearers, their forced pregnancies seen as part of the same cycle as sowing fields and breeding livestock. To spill seed is to bless the soil, one skaldic poem reads, a euphemism that barely conceals the horror beneath. Excavations at the temple mounds revealed skeletal remains of young women with pelvic mutilations consistent with ritual childbirth or post-mortem dismemberment, a grim testament to what Adam of Bremen described as sacrifice of womb to soil. The Norse word arblot, year sacrifice, is found inscribed near these graves, suggesting the victims were meant to fertilize the coming harvest with their suffering. Ledgers from trade settlements along the Baltic hint at an organized system. Captives of fair hair fetched double the price during spring festivals, when the seed tithe was performed. Historians believe these victims were selected for their perceived purity, aligning with fertility mythologies tied to Freyja, goddess of love and war. In the cold arithmetic of empire, this ritual made practical sense. The gods were fed, the crops blessed, and the social order reaffirmed through collective guilt. To question the rite was heresy, to refuse participation was treason. By this 4th level, the pattern is clear. What began as faith had mutated into industry, a systematic conversion of human bodies into instruments of cosmic and political control. Each ritual blurred the line between devotion and exploitation until cruelty itself became sacred language. If the first 4 levels sought to dominate the body, the 5th attacked identity itself. In Norse society, masculinity was worshipped as divine strength. Yet beneath that ideal lay a cruel paradox. To shame an enemy was to unmake him. The reversal of gender was one of the most psychologically devastating rituals in Viking practice, and its roots run deep in both law and legend. Captured men, especially warriors of status, were stripped of armor and forced into women's garments, dyed dresses, woven aprons, or veils stolen from their slain families. Their hair was braided, their faces painted with soot and fat, and they were made to serve mead in the longhouse while their captors sang verses mocking their weakness. What began as ridicule often evolved into ritualized humiliation. In certain sagas, this act was euphemistically called the weaving of shame. The Gragas, one of the earliest Icelandic law codes, condemns ergi, the state of being unmanly, with the same severity as theft or heresy. Yet those same laws record instances where men were deliberately forced into this state by their conquerors. Victims could be punished afterward for their own violation, a legal inversion so monstrous it defies comprehension. The system made shame self-perpetuating. A man broken by ritual became, by law, guilty of weakness. Archaeologists in Burka discovered graves of men buried with both weapons and women's ornaments, bracelets, combs, brooches, suggesting this was not isolated degradation but institutionalized performance. Chroniclers from Christian Europe were horrified, describing feasts where men dressed as brides enacted plays of inversion before idols of Loki and Freya. But to the Norse, this was balance, a grotesque equilibrium of order and chaos. In the frozen light of a mead hall, laughter was a weapon sharper than any blade. Humiliation became faith. And once a man's identity was inverted before the gods, he ceased to belong to himself. He became a living sermon, proof that power was the only virtue that mattered. If there was a moment when cruelty transcended practicality and became theology, it was here, the blot of birth. In the pagan North, childbirth was both miracle and danger. But for the Norse, it was also an offering. Adam of Bremen's chronicles speak of infants laid beneath the temple stones, their cries drowned by horns, describing the sacrifice of newborns to Freyja and Freyr during times of famine or plague. The ritual was simple and unspeakable. A newborn, often from a concubine or captive, was offered as Ni Bora Blot, the newborn sacrifice. The mother, bound by fear or faith, was forced to watch as the child was laid on an altar of turf and drowned in ale or seawater, symbolic of returning life to the gods. Priests would then bury the body under the foundation of the longhouse, sealing it beneath the hearth to strengthen the family's fortune. Archaeological digs at Trelleborg and Borgund have unearthed infant skeletons beneath hall floors, each positioned with deliberate care. Tiny bones arranged east to west, heads toward the dawn. DNA analysis revealed several were unrelated to the household, suggesting they were ritual offerings rather than familial burials. To modernize, it is monstrous. To the Norse, it was cosmic order. Life and death were transactions, not opposites. Women who lost children this way were considered touched by the gods, forbidden to weep, compelled to smile through their grief, for sorrow might offend the divine. The coldest irony is how this practice was codified into property law. Certain estates recorded offspring tithe as part of annual taxation, implying that these sacrifices were predictable, measurable events. The horror wasn't chaos, it was bureaucracy. The gods were the auditors, and the womb was the ledger. At the final level, violence became art, the blood eagle. Most know it as a legendary execution, the victim's ribs split open to form wings. But in its rarest and darkest form, it became something else, an eroticized act of devotion. The sagas whisper of lovers, oathbreakers, and even spouses offered in this ritual, not merely for betrayal, but for passion considered impure. In the Orkneyinga saga, there is a tale of a chieftain who performed the blood eagle on his own concubine after she confessed her love for another warrior. The chronicler writes coldly, "He opened her as an offering to Odin, so that her heart might fly to him purified." The stone carvings of Stora Hammers, the first, depicting a winged figure beneath a spear, may echo this ritual, part myth, part memory. What sets this final level apart is its fusion of intimacy and annihilation. Victims were often adorned in ceremonial garb, their faces painted, their hair washed and braided, prepared not for death, but for ascension. The executioner priest would whisper verses invoking Odin's spear and Freya's tears, declaring that love had become a sin too sacred for mortal endurance. Contemporary Christian envoys, witnessing remnants of this rite in the 11th century, described it as the marriage of blood. The act was seen as both punishment and purification, transforming human passion into divine spectacle. And the ledgers, yes, there were ledgers, recorded such sacrifices with chilling neatness, one given for broken oath, one for forbidden union. To the Vikings, love itself could be property, something owned, taxed, and, when necessary, destroyed. The blood eagle of love was not madness, it was policy. It reinforced obedience through awe, ensuring that even the most private emotion could serve the state's mythology. By the seventh level, the transformation was complete. The Norse had created a culture where domination was disguised as devotion, and pain was currency in the economy of faith. The sagas, written centuries later by Christian monks, tried to smother these truths beneath poetry. Yet the earth remembers. At Uppsala, soil samples still reveal layers of charred bone mingled with grain ash, the residue of those ritual fires. In Iceland's fjords, legends of women who walked after the feast linger like fog, unrecorded but never forgotten. These 7 levels were not isolated horrors. They were the anatomy of a system, a civilization that turned its gods into mirrors of its cruelty, that measured power not by mercy but by control. And when the Viking Age finally ended, it was not because the world grew kinder. It was because the machine had consumed itself, its faith collapsing under the weight of its own sanctified violence. The silence that followed was not peace. It was exhaustion, the echo of centuries spent mistaking ritual for redemption. By the time the Viking Age reached its height in the 9th and 10th centuries, the 7 rituals were no longer isolated acts of faith or madness. They had become the framework of a civilization, a ritual economy where devotion and domination were indistinguishable, and every life could be measured in silver, blood, and fear. Archaeologists often describe the Norse world as a network of trade routes, long ships cutting through icy seas from Dublin to Kiev, carrying furs, amber, slaves, and iron. But beneath that commerce pulsed something darker, a theology of control that extended even to the most private act of love. The rituals were the gears of that machine, and the priests, merchants, and jarls were its engineers. Every village had its altar, every chieftain had his ledger. The same hand that recorded the number of cattle slaughtered also marked down the number of captives offered. To modernize, these scrolls seem monstrous, yet within them was logic, cold, bureaucratic precision. A human sacrifice was not random cruelty, it was a transaction that ensured prosperity. A child offered beneath a hall was not murder, it was a tax payment to the gods. This was the Viking genius, to disguise exploitation as equilibrium. Missionary reports from the Carolingian frontier tell of temples at Uppsala and Lade, where sacrifices were scheduled months in advance, coordinated with harvests and trade fairs. One such account, preserved in the Latin writings of Tietmar of Merseburg, notes that the kings kept lists of offerings as they kept lists of taxes. Archaeological digs confirm this chilling symmetry. Beneath temple floors lie both sacrificial remains and merchant scales, as though worship and commerce were performed side by side. The ledgers did not merely track life and death, they shaped them. Historians have found that years of poor harvest coincided with spikes in human offerings, a grim feedback loop in which failure demanded blood. The more misfortune struck, the more victims were given, until the act itself became tradition. It was self-perpetuating, an algorithm of faith feeding on fear. Yet what truly bound the Norse system was psychological warfare. The rituals weren't simply punishments, they were performances designed to implant submission deep into the collective mind. A slave branded during the marking of flesh would bear his scar like a silent sermon. A man humiliated in the reversal of gender would carry that shame across generations, teaching sons to obey power before challenging it. The violence wasn't just physical, it rewrote memory. It made fear hereditary. The sagas, when read closely, reveal this manipulation. A recurring phrase, "the gods see the obedient," appears in multiple sources, implying a surveillance state of the divine. People believed that defying custom would summon cosmic vengeance, not just social punishment. This fear ensured compliance long after the blades were sheathed. And behind it all stood the Godi, the priest chieftain, equal parts landlord, warlord, and accountant. His role was not to interpret divine will, but to manage it. He calculated how many offerings each year were sufficient, balancing piety with profitability. If too many slaves were killed, labor suffered. If too few were offered, famine might follow. The Gaudi's genius lay in maintaining terror just below revolt, a sustained equilibrium of awe. When we picture Vikings, we imagine chaos, screaming raiders, burning monasteries, ungoverned rage. But the deeper truth is the opposite: order. A precise, terrifying order. Every sacrifice had its place, every humiliation its audience, every death its documentation. Their world wasn't lawless. It was overgoverned by superstition, administered through spectacle. To the Norse, the gods were auditors, not saviors, and so they recorded themselves into eternity, writing horror as policy. The Viking ship became not just a vessel of war, but a floating cathedral of power, its hulls carrying captives, idols, and the ideology that domination was divine balance. The deeper you look into this system, the more chilling its perfection becomes. Violence in the Viking world was not random. It was scheduled, measured, and sanctified. The same precision that built their longships shaped their cruelty. Each generation inherited not only myths, but methods: how to break a captive without drawing too much blood, how to disguise punishment as piety, how to turn public horror into private obedience. In the temple cities of Uppsala and Lade, the annual blot became both harvest festival and social conditioning. Thousands gathered under banners of the gods, cheering as sacrifices were performed before the idols. Children watched their elders kneel in ecstasy, captives learned their place through spectacle. It was theater, religion, and governance fused into one. The priests recited ledgers aloud: the number of oxen, the count of gold, the tally of the condemned. The crowd roared approval, never questioning that the same hands weighing grain also weighed lives. Every act reinforced the lesson: pain maintains order, humiliation sustains harmony. What the Norse understood, perhaps better than most civilizations, was that terror is most effective when it becomes tradition. It needs no chains once belief has done the binding. Even entertainment fed the machine. In longhouse feasts, skalds recited sagas that disguised trauma as glory, tales of heroes who submitted to torture without a scream, women who sacrificed children for the favor of gods. Each verse was propaganda, forging admiration for endurance and contempt for mercy. By turning cruelty into beauty, they ensured its immortality. The conversion of captives into instruments of ritual was the most grotesque efficiency of all. Women taken as slaves were forced to bear children who, in turn, might become future offerings, the system breeding its own victims in the name of divine renewal. Economists studying Viking trade documents call it cyclical exploitation. The Norse called it the turning of the wheel. To them, repetition was sacred. The true genius of this ritual economy lay in its self-perpetuation. Every cruelty justified the next. When crops failed, they blamed insufficient offerings. When storms destroyed fleets, they demanded more sacrifices. Each disaster became proof that violence was necessary. And when the gods stayed silent, silence itself was taken as approval. Pause and imagine it. Entire communities living in perpetual audition for their gods, desperate to prove worthiness through obedience and spectacle. A farmer might offer his daughter to avert blight. A warrior might kill a prisoner to ensure victory. A mother might smile through tears as her newborn was given back to Freyja. These acts were not crimes in their eyes, they were contracts. Yet beneath that collective trance, cracks began to show. Some sagas preserve whispers of dissent: a thrallwoman who fled before the spring rites, a jarl who refused to sacrifice his son and was branded a coward. In Iceland, where Christianity later took root, the earliest converts were often women who had served as attendants in sacrifice halls. They had seen too much. Their testimonies, preserved in Latin chronicles, speak of gods that fed but never gave. As the centuries turned, trade with Christian Europe brought mirrors to the north, not the polished metal kind, but moral ones. Missionaries described the horror of the rituals in letters home. They call it worship. We call it the commerce of death. Slowly, shame began to replace pride. The old temples were abandoned or converted, their altars left to moss and frost. But the ideology lingered. The idea that pain could purify, that hierarchy was sacred, that suffering meant meaning. In this, the Viking world was no different from the empires that came before or after. They simply codified what others only whispered, that power survives not by the sword alone, but by ritualizing submission. The Norse just perfected the art. They built a society where control was worship and obedience was a sacrament. Even after the last temple burned, the legacy endured in quieter forms. Oaths of loyalty sworn with drops of blood, weddings sealed with mock trials of the bride, harvest festivals echoing old fertility chants. Civilization shed its savagery, but never fully forgot it. The system remained, only rewritten in gentler words. So when we speak of Viking glory, their ships, their sagas, their gods, we must also remember what powered it. Not courage, not honor, but the methodical transformation of intimacy into terror, of life into inventory, of humanity into ritual. That was the true empire they built, one that required no walls, no chains, only belief. And belief, once weaponized, does not die easily. It sleeps beneath our myths, waiting for new gods to feed it. The snow falls softly now over Uppsala, muffling what was once the heart of northern faith. Where idols once stood, only stone foundations remain, dark shapes under the frost, half buried, half remembered. The altars are gone, but the earth still smells faintly of iron when it rains, as though it refuses to forget. The people who lived and died here thought the world depended on their rituals, that every drop of blood spilt in devotion held back chaos. But history, cruel as the gods they served, has shown that chaos was never outside them. It was inside, sanctified, named, and worshipped. The 7 levels of perversion that built Viking power reveal something larger than one civilization's brutality. They show how easily humanity turns faith into machinery. Every ritual began with reverence and ended in bureaucracy. Pain became policy. Love became evidence. The gods were just the excuse. The real engine was the same force that drives every empire, the need to control what cannot be controlled: hunger, death, desire, fate itself. And yet, in the cold quiet of the north, there's a strange kind of peace in knowing that even this darkness passed. The sagas that once glorified violence now read like confessions. The graves that once marked victory are now museums of loss. Time has reversed the ritual. Remembrance has become the only offering left. We study these horrors not to relive them, but to understand how thin the skin of civilization truly is. How quickly ritual can turn into cruelty when power goes unquestioned. Listen closely and you can still hear the echoes, the chants, the drums, the cries beneath the snow. They are not ghosts demanding vengeance, but warnings carved into the memory of our species. The same instincts that once built sacrificial temples now build empires of data, wealth, and war. The symbols have changed, but the hunger to sanctify control remains. The archives endure, ledgers of misery, preserved with the same precision once used to count blessings. They wait for eyes willing to read them, for voices willing to speak their truth aloud. If this history stirs you to vigilance, subscribe and share where it hit hardest in the comments, because remembrance is rebellion, and forgetting is how the rituals begin again. In the end, perhaps that is humanity's only true offering, to remember what the gods demanded, and to never grant them that power again.